Hello friends, Steve Stockton here with you. Welcome to our latest video. Today, we bring you the strange story of missing people, lost gold, in the Superstition Mountains. Join me, let's take a walk and see. Now, I first became aware of the Superstition Mountains in 1978 when author Jim Brandon published a book called Weird America, a guide to places of mystery in the United States. This seminal work in the area of the paranormal, the strange, gives a state-by-state breakdown of all kinds of weird happenings. Here's what Jim had to write about the superstitions, quoting here, 40 miles due east from the neon vinyl motels and nighties of the Phoenix Van Buren Street is a sort of heart of darkness. The name mountains is only one of the deceptions of this spiky huddle of volcanic extrusions raking up from the floor of the hostile desert. Old-timers in the area can tell you more. Little white clouds that suddenly materialize and follow the wanderer, freak gales that spring up while you're inching along some narrow rock ledge, and all sorts of psycho-atmospheric effects in the best Castaneda tradition that die away immediately if you leave some apparently sensitive area. Jim continues, quote, longtime seekers of the dazzling treasures believe hidden here. Of course, there are treasures, half a dozen of them, including the Lost Dutchman mine, which we'll get to in a moment, swear that there are certain caves and rocks that simply cannot be photographed. And then there's the whole question of Native Americans. Some claim that they have never seen one in the area. Others are equally sure they have seen many, all pygmies. The Native Americans themselves are pretty well agreed that the abode of the supreme evil forces of the Southwest live in the superstition. The Pima and Maricopa steer a wide course around the mountains, thinking that entering them means immediate death or diabolical possession. Now, the Apache do not avoid the entire area, but only certain places that they too regard as hideously evil. Students of little-known Apache folklore believe that the chief medicine place is a secret cave, possibly on the peak known as Geronimo's Head. Another possible spot, they say, is Needle Canyon, which is near Weaver's Needle. We'll get to that in a minute. Apache spokesmen have recently revealed this much, that the tribe believes it is in a special relationship with the mountain spirits, a secret society of strange beings who do special work. For the Apache, these sacred mountains are a sort of gateway to the hereafter, through which the souls of the dead must pass, and it is the function of the mountain spirits to guide them. The Native Americans help by protecting the area from white desecration. End quote. That's a local saying that many people who go into the mountains are not the same when they come out. This may have very well been the case with an eccentric German immigrant of the 19th century named Jacob Waltz, although this Dutchman does seem to have hit pay dirt of sufficient enough richness that generations of treasure hunters have swarmed over this pile of rocks looking for his lost gold mine. Beyond that, there are at least 3 other major treasures and as many minor ones, Geronimo's treasure, the Jesuit treasure, and the Peralta treasure, which we'll get to shortly. That treasure is also the link to one of the most forbidding part of the superstition's evil repute. The Peraltas, a prominent family from Sonora, discovered fabulous gold lodes here in 1830, but were wiped out along with their crews by the Apache in 1848. Estimates of that slaughter number anywhere from 68 to 400. In the 20th century alone, there were 36 known deaths and disappearances in this area. Despite some of these being solved, author Kurt Gentry points out in his book The Killer Mountains, this still leaves a huge number of unexplained deaths and disappearances for such a sparsely populated area. One of the stranger aspects is the method of these demises. A great number of these involved decapitation. Apparently this began in 1896 with the death of a slightly deranged but harmless mountain man named Elijah Rivas. In recent years, says Kurt Gentry, these unexplained deaths and disappearances have been increasing. Now remember, he wrote this many years ago, but he closes with this observation. There's something important in this particular area. What? Now, Jim Brandon's book, Weird America, it is long out of print. As of this recording, there's one used copy available on Amazon for the princely sum of $459. I'm fortunate enough to have a signed copy that I bought in 1978. It's one of my most treasured books. If you can find a copy, it's worth checking out. But I digress. Let us continue. Now, the Superstition Mountains get their name from old Pima Indian legends, and the name itself aptly describes this mysterious place, which, as I stated, has been the subject of many strange mysteries, phantoms, and legends since ancient times. According to many Native Americans in the area, the mountains themselves are believed to hold the entrance to the underworld. Many of the cliff dwellings and caves are also ancient, and actually show signs that at one time they were occupied. Though no one knows for sure who it was that actually occupied these caves and other dwellings, there are many theories on the subject. Whoever it was, the mountains became a bastion for the Apache tribe sometime in the 1800s. Earlier, I mentioned the Peralta family said that in the 1840s they came from northern New Mexico and developed rich gold mines somewhere in the Superstition Mountains. In 1848, the last expedition to export gold from the mountains and back to Mexico was undertaken, but those people were ambushed, according to the legends, by the Apache tribe. Only one or two of the people on this expedition, all members of the Peralta family, managed to escape, and even today, this area is still known as the Massacre Grounds. Now, there are a few people who are alleged to have known the location of these mines, and there have been more than a few maps that have surfaced out there throughout the years. However, when someone would ask questions in order to go and find these mines, the alleged maps would somehow have gone missing or otherwise not be able to be located anymore. On top of this mystery surrounding the maps, men who have claimed to have found the mines are never actually able to point out to anyone where they were or were able to make their own way back to them. Otherwise, these same men would often claim that some strange disaster had happened before they were able to make any sort of claim on the gold or the mines themselves. All this, when put together, adds to the legend and lore of there being a lost mine or mines somewhere in this strange, mysterious mountain range. Now, the aforementioned Dutchman, German native Jacob Waltz that I mentioned, back in the 1870s, he claimed he had somehow contacted a descendant of the Peralta family and that they showed him where the mine was. The Dutchman's claim was that he actually knew the location of the mine. Along with his partner, Jacob Weiser, the two claimed to have not only worked in the actual mine, but they'd also hidden away a few caches of gold in the Superstitions. Now, most of these legends have the caches hidden near a place called Weaver's Needle, which is a fairly well-known landmark that I mentioned earlier as near one of the places where the spirits supposedly dwell. However, it seems as though some bad luck befell the two almost right away, depending on which story you choose to set store by. As some say the Apaches killed Jacob Weiser, but many believe it was actually the Dutchman, Jacob Waltz, himself, who murdered his partner to keep the gold and possibly the secret of where the mines were, for and to himself. Later, though, due to his failing health, Jacob Waltz ended up having to stop mining gold and going on adventures and moved to Phoenix to live out the rest of his life. He passed away in 1891, allegedly having only revealed the location of the mine to one other person, a woman named Julia Thomas, who was a neighbor of Jacob's and cared for him when his health made it so he could no longer care for himself. She claimed that he had not only shared with her the location of the mine, but also the location of the caches of gold that he and his ill-fated partner had hidden some 20 years earlier. She even claimed he drew her a map, but admits that she just saw it as a bunch of scribbling and was unsure what to do with it or make of it. So she sold it for a measly $7. However, in the following years, there were dozens upon dozens of seekers of the mine and the caches, Julia included, and as far as is known, not a single one of them was ever able to find either one. This is when the mine seems to have first become known as the Lost Dutchman's mine, and more people would go on throughout the years to traverse the dangerous paths and trails in and along these mountains, searching caves and other dangerous areas, only to come up completely empty-handed. In fact, many of these intrepid treasure hunters not only met their demise, but many with some sort of foul play or another suspected in the process. Again, these sometimes strange deaths seem to some to lead credence to the stories, legends, and superstitions of not only the Lost Dutchman's mine and the curse allegedly attached to it, but to the strange Superstition Mountains themselves. Now let's take a look at some of the strange disappearances surrounding the hunt for this elusive mine and the treasure it's said to contain. The Lost Dutchman's gold mine is one of the most famous mysteries in the United States, so it should come as no surprise that so many people go out each year and search for it in earnest, despite all the aforementioned strange and somewhat spooky legends that surround it and the Superstition Mountains themselves. Rumor has it that approximately 600 people have lost their lives or gone missing in search of these treasures. Are these people out of their minds, following what could simply be the delirious ramblings of an old man who knew he was so close to death? Or should they be considered as ambitious dream chasers in pursuit of wealth beyond anything they could imagine? We'll leave that one up for you to decide. Now, the aforementioned massacre that happened in 1848 regarding the Peralta family, these people are said to have discovered the Dutchman's mine right within the Superstition Mountains, where most people believe it to be. The problem with that is, did they actually find it? Could it be the alleged Superstition's curse? As they set out on what should have otherwise been a routine gold mining expedition, the entire family was slain by the Apache Indian tribe. They were said to have been ambushed, and any gold the family had on them is said to have been hidden right then and there by the same tribe. There's also a man named Jesse Cappan, who was said to have allowed the Lost Dutchman's mine to become an obsession for him. Jesse became convinced that he would somehow be the one to not only locate the mine itself, but the one who would gain the spoils of it as well. Wealth and riches beyond anyone's wildest dreams had entranced Jesse. He was absolutely enthralled with finding the mine. Jesse was a night bellman at a hotel and was affectionately called the Gentle Giant by those who knew him best. In November of 2009, he had finally saved up enough money and vacation time to go on and pursue his dream of finding the lost, legendary treasure. Jerry traded in his car for a Jeep and told his mother that he would call her as soon as he could. But the first call she received wasn't from her son, but from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Jesse's new Jeep and his camp had been found, seemingly abandoned, on Tortilla Mountain. There was no sign of the 35-year-old, and an investigation into his whereabouts quickly ensued. Countless books on the subject and maps littered his apartment when it was searched after he disappeared. It was also found, through the examination of many files on his computer, that he had already gone on 2 other excursions in an attempt to locate it, but with no luck. He hadn't told anyone of these adventures, and it was news to all who knew him when it finally came out. At the devastatingly young age of just 35, Jesse would become another victim of the lost mine when he went on his 3rd trip out into the Tonto National Forest, located in the Superstition Wilderness, back in 2009. Despite there being a very large-scale investigation into what had happened to him, it took 3 years for his remains to be located and identified. Volunteers with the Superstition Search and Rescue Organization found Jesse's remains wedged inside of a tiny crevice or opening that seemed no fully grown human being would ever have been able to fit into. It's theorized that perhaps he somehow fell from a ledge directly above where he was eventually found, 180 feet in the ground. There's never been any proof of this, and the official cause of death could not be determined. There's also the fact that his remains were found in such a tiny and thin place that even animals in flooding couldn't touch him. There was no trauma to his skull, and the authorities and everyone else were left to wonder and speculate did just that. What happened to Jesse Kaplan on this trip that was so different from the previous 2 he'd taken? And why was he going in secret every time? And how did he get wedged into such a tiny spot in which he was eventually found? Is it possible that Jesse had in fact found the treasure and maybe was hiding it down there in that impossibly tiny crevice when something happened to him? Sure, anything is possible, but we will most likely never know what that something was, if anything, and what we're left with is nothing but rumor and conjecture, which adds even more mystery to the Lost Dutchman legend. Back in June of 1931, Dr. Adolph Ruth took 2 weeks to go and search for the treasure and ended up becoming yet another victim. Dr. Ruth was a veterinarian from Washington, D.C., and it said that his disappearance was what sparked many of the modern-day legends about the gold and the mountains themselves. This was the first nationally reported story regarding someone disappearing in search of the treasure, and many believe that had it not been for the Great Depression, perhaps this story would have been but a mere blip on the radar of a depressed and oppressed nation. However, it seems that reading about a treasure hunter with a mysterious map, despite the fact that he died in the process of trying to locate it, seemed much more appealing for Americans to read about than the dire state of the nation at the time. Dr. Ruth had, by some unknown means, allegedly gotten his hands on a treasure map that led to the Lost Dutchman's gold that is said to have dated back to the period of the Mexican Revolution, which took place between 1909 and 1923. Irwin Cleve Ruth, Dr. Adolph Ruth's son, had acquired a copy of the map as a seemingly generous reward for saving the life of a Mexican officer and handed it off to his father as a gift. Now, Adolph had almost lost his life at least once, searching for other allegedly lost treasures across the country, and this certainly wasn't his first time doing this sort of thing. He had suffered severe injuries and brushes with death a few times, but wasn't the least bit deterred. In fact, it was while he was in the hospital recuperating from one such accident that he started planning his search for the fabled Lost Dutchman mine. Sometime in mid-May of 1931, Dr. Ruth was able to convince a couple of men, more specifically 2 cowboy/prospectors, to help him with his quest. These men worked at what was then known as the Quarter Circle U Ranch, and against the advice of the ranch's owner, these 2 men agreed to pack him up and lead him into the mountains. Their names were Leroy Purnell and Jack Keenan, and they packed Dr. Ruth into a place called Willow Springs in West Boulder Canyon around June 14, 1931. It was only a short time later that Dr. Ruth disappeared. The owner of the Quarter Circle U Ranch, a man named Tex Barkley, rode into Adolph's camp on June 20, 1931, and upon examining the site, determined the doctor hadn't been there in at least a full 24 hours. Tex alerted the authorities, and an intense and large-scale search lasted 45 days, and eventually he was tracked from Willow Springs to a point on the east slope of Blacktop Mesa. On December 10, 1931, a skull was found, and was quickly able to be identified as that of Adolph Ruth. Deputy Sheriff Jeff Adams and ranch owner Tex Barkley found the remainder of the doctor's skeleton a little over a month later in January of 1932. It was found in a small tributary on the eastern slope of Blacktop Mesa. The map, which has now come to be known as the Ruth Peralta map, was found in his camp, and the newspaper, the Arizona Republic, published a copy of it. Now, the Maricopa and Pinal County Sheriff's offices both agree that Dr. Adolph Ruth wasn't murdered, as so many people have implied since his remains were found, but that he most likely died of dehydration and starvation, which technically made his death determined to be natural causes, at least officially. Many people believe that because his skull was found so far removed from the rest of his body that he must have been decapitated. But those rumors were said to have been put to rest with the explanation of coyotes and other animals, as well as post-mortem predation and activity. However, there are still those who believe thoroughly that something more sinister than being unprepared or perhaps becoming lost befell Dr. Ruth. Regardless of what actually happened to him, it's another tragedy nonetheless that can be attributed to the seeking of this one particular treasure. And despite the tragedy of Dr. Ruth being an extremely public ordeal, especially for the time, it didn't stop other people from going in search of this alleged vast vein of riches, just waiting to be claimed up there somewhere in the mountains. In fact, it's almost as though these strange disappearances and unexplained deaths helped to lure more people to it. Sometime in the 1940s, a 62-year-old treasure hunter by the name of James Cravey took to the mountains on his own quest for the lost gold. Unfortunately, and quite bizarrely, he also came to the fate of having met his demise, also with his head being found separated and far removed from his body. James didn't keep his travels secret like so many before him, though, and his journey to find the mine was a big deal. He made sure his search for the gold was the biggest spectacle yet. Before he boarded the helicopter, which he had hired to drop him off in the mountains, he told many of his friends and family, and basically anyone who would listen to him, that he knew the exact location of the mine and that he would be in and out in no time. He gave the helicopter pilot who dropped him off the coordinates for where to pick him up in 10 days' time, as this was how long he had planned to be there. No more, no less than 10 days, and he would come out of it wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. Of course, when the helicopter did return for James, he was nowhere in sight. To this day, nobody really knows what happened to him, but it's presumed that he was slain due to the aforementioned fact that his head was found separated from his shoulders, but there isn't any evidence one way or the other. His camp was found intact and with only 2 days of his food and supplies having been used. Then in early 1952, a man from Dayton, Ohio named Joseph Kelly took his turn meeting his demise in search of the treasure, and it seems as though he just disappeared off the face of the earth. That is, until 2 years later, when his remains were found. Upon further examination, it was concluded that he had been shot in the head, but no more information has ever been learned as to who killed him, when, or why. Later that same year, 2 young men from California went in search of the treasure and were never seen or heard from again. No remains have ever been found, and their case remains a mystery of the mountain like so many that came before and after. It's said that the only thing more mysterious than James Kidd's disappearance while searching for the Dutchman's gold was his life in general. James had very little family and even fewer friends. He had what has been described as a ridiculous sum of money, most of which he acquired through investing. No one could ever figure out, and James never told, where he got the initial cash to make those investments in the first place, though. It is interesting to note here that James is also said to have come and gone from the Superstition Mountains quite regularly, often making very short trips, though he of course never explained to anyone what he was doing when he went on these many excursions. Speculation ran rampant after he disappeared that perhaps he'd found the treasure and was going to and from it and taking small amounts as he needed, and that's how he really built his fortune. Though he was reported as missing on December 29, 1949, it's said that he'd been gone for a very long time at this point, but there was no one in his life that he was close enough to that would have noticed or even cared that he was no longer around. A few years after his disappearance, it was found that James Kidd had left behind a fortune of $500,000. In today's money, that would amount to somewhere around $10.5 million US. Quite bizarrely, it's unknown whatever happened to this massive fortune, because the stipulation for anyone to be left this money is that they had to be able to definitively prove the existence of ghosts. An avid lifelong believer in all things paranormal and supernatural, the few who did know him in any capacity were not surprised when this news came out. Most people believed that he was simply killed for his gold, or that someone had followed him up into the mountains that last time, maybe even the man who is said to have dropped him off from the helicopter there in the first place. But, again, nobody knows. The man who brought him here also met with him once a month to check on him and make sure he had ample supplies to be able to continue on, so it seems he was making a longer trek than usual that last time. It's still unknown what became of him, and no remains or clues have ever been found. Now here it should be noted that between the years of 1955 and 1978, multiple skulls with bullet holes in them were found in the mountains. Aside from those we've already discussed here, there were at least an additional 2 cadavers found without their heads, but in these cases, the skulls were never found. The actual cause of death for these 2, and so many more unfortunate people who ended up as nothing but remains in the superstitions, are still unknown. Another unfortunate soul who was unknowingly destined to end up another statistic of the mountains and the gold it allegedly hid so well, and also one of the owners of the headless corpse mentioned above, was a man named Jay Clapp. Jay spent more than a decade going in and out of the superstitions and trying to plot his way through in search of the Dutchman's treasure, before seeming to simply vanish into thin air in July of 1961. There have never been any clues or leads as to what could have become of him, and to this day, his skull has never been located. Interestingly, and somewhat bizarrely, his body was found near Weaver's Needle, which is the exact same place that said the Dutchman himself had hidden his gold caches. Elisha Rivas, who I mentioned earlier, was definitely an interesting character. He settled into the Superstition Mountains in 1872 and was quickly, and some say aptly, nicknamed the Madman of the Mountains. He convinced the local Native American tribes in the area where he chose to settle that he was an absolute lunatic by running around naked throughout the canyons while wielding knives. Now, the natives weren't the only ones who chose to stay clear of this madman, and he is said to have lived a very solitary and somewhat quiet life on the mountains, until one day he just wasn't there anymore. Now, it's unknown how long he'd been missing before his remains were found some 24 years later in 1896, but they were very badly decomposed. Then there were 2 men who are only described as Easterners who are said to have gone out looking for the elusive and deadly treasure the same year Elisha Reeves' remains were found. Nobody knows what became of them either. No trace of them has ever been found. Then, in April of 1958, another mystery was added to the ever-growing list of mountain victims when a deserted campsite was found somewhere on the northern outskirts. The scene was pretty dreadful, with bed skirts, sheets, and blankets described as having been soaked with blood found left behind. Along with the bloody bedclothes, there were cooking tools, a Geiger counter, cleaning supplies, and what appears to be personal letters. It's still unknown whether it was simply one person or several people who occupied this camp, and this is mainly because someone had taken the time to tear the names and addresses from the letters, effectively leaving no trace as to who resided there or any other personal relevant information about them. No body or bodies were ever found either, and it's simply marked down as another tragic mystery of this whole bigger puzzle that the mountains and the alleged lost treasure hold. Also, in 1910, in a cave high up on the Superstitions, the skeletal remains of a woman who is said to have been clutching a small sack of gold was found. There were no remnants of any clothing, and nothing to allude to what happened to her in the first place. Quite honestly, it's said as though it simply looked like she'd found some gold and simply perished right then and there on the spot with no explanation at all. These are the types of mysteries that surround places like the Superstition Mountains. The Lost Dutchman's mine has become something of a legend in pop culture. It's been the subject of many books and even TV shows since it all began so very long ago. To this day, there are people who are obsessed with the alleged maps and cracking the codes and discovering the secrets within in order to find the treasure. As far as what's been actually proven, though, we still don't know if anyone has ever actually found it and whether or not it ever existed at all in the first place. What about all of the mysterious disappearances and strange deaths? How do we explain all the bodies found in such bizarre states of being, and the overall seeming bad luck that no doubt surrounds not only the legend, but those who go in search of it? Even if we only take all the skulls that have been found throughout the years with bullets in them, it would seem as though at least someone were trying to keep something a secret out there in the Superstitions. What that something is, though, nobody really knows. It does seem a great number of these unexplained disappearances and strange deaths circle around people who are out in search of the treasure, and it's for that very reason alone that this particular mystery is one that many believe should be left alone, to remain unsolved. But there are those who simply can't resist the call of the mountains, though. Or maybe it's the fact that should they find the treasure, they would know wealth beyond anything they could ever have imagined, even if it means tempting fate and possibly ending up dead or worse. It's hard to say what's really going on here, but the allure and the danger are equally undeniable And more than likely, this is another one of those bizarre legends that will continue on through the ages, perhaps until someone finds the treasure or otherwise proves it doesn't exist. Well, friends, there you have it. What do you think about these strange stories and legends of the Superstition Mountains and the Lost Dutchman mine? As always, I look forward to your comments, but please keep it friendly and respectful. Also, consider becoming a member of the channel. For less than the price of a good cup of coffee, you can take advantage of special membership perks and surprises. Just click the join button. Until we meet again, be good to yourselves and others. As for me, I'll see you a little further on down the trail. I'm Steve Stockton, and I'll talk to you next time.